Okay, let me start with a question for you. What if the map of global history you've always held in your mind, with its clear centers and edges, what if it was fundamentally upside down? What if the true axis the world spun on for thousands of years wasn't where you think it was at all? Today, we're doing a deep dive into a really extraordinary book that challenges, well, pretty much everything we thought we knew about world history. It's Peter Frankopan's The Silk Roads, A New History of the World. We're going to unpack its central argument, look at some of the fascinating details, and hopefully help you, our listener, gain a new, much more interconnected view of our past.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book because it really does invite you to question those standard stories, those traditional narratives we all learn, and to think again about where civilization really flourished and how different cultures exchanged so much more than just, stuff, ideas, technology, religion. It all moved. So our mission today is basically to see how history looks from a different angle, a vantage point that's been, well, largely forgotten for a long time.
So how does Frankopan start building this case? He actually begins quite personally, talking about his childhood map. Staring at it above his bed, he knew all the countries, capitals, rivers, but as he got older, he started feeling, well, uneasy about how narrow his school history felt. Very Eurocentric. It was all, Romans in Britain, the Norman conquest, Henry VIII, the American Revolution, that sort of thing. And he'd look at his world map and see these huge foundational parts of the world just passed over in complete silence.
That's such a crucial starting point. He connects that feeling to what the anthropologist Eric Wolf called the accepted and lazy history of civilization. You know the one. It's that straight line. Ancient Greece leads to Rome, Rome leads to Christian Europe leads to the Renaissance, and eventually Tanakh, the United States. The book flat out calls this narrative flawed. It argues it gets presented as this great political, cultural, and moral triumph of the West because, well, it's told by the winners of recent history. It's a really powerful point. History is always a story somebody tells, and sometimes controls.
And it's not just academic theory pointing this out. Frankopan uses actual historical maps. They tell completely different stories. Like the Hereford Mappa Mundi, Jerusalem is right at the center, England, Western Europe, almost irrelevant, stuck out on the edge. Or think about Arab geographers whose maps often centered on the Caspian Sea. To our eyes, Europe looks literally upside down on those. And get this, a medieval Turkish map centered on a city called Balasagum, once thought to be the heart of the world. Now, it's so forgotten we weren't even sure exactly where it was until recently. These aren't just quirky old maps, they seriously challenge our built-in geographical assumptions.
Exactly. These different maps point towards the book's big geographical reveal. For literally millennia, the real axis on which the globe spun wasn't the Med, it wasn't the Atlantic. It was this huge region running roughly from the Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea right over to the Himalayas. Now, today we might think of that area, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Syria, as maybe unstable, peripheral even, but historically. That was the absolute crossroads of civilization. I mean, this is where civilization started, Mesopotamia, right? Often thought of as the Garden of Eden.
It really does make you rethink everything, doesn't it? And this region wasn't just old, it was incredibly innovative. I mean, picture this. While Europe was still finding its feet, cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro and the Indus Valley had sophisticated sewage systems. Thousands of years before the West, Babylon, Nineveh, Uruk, Akkad, legendary for their scale and grandeur, and places like Bactria in northern Afghanistan, known for its skilled negotiators and traders. This was the crucible. It's where Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism all emerged, jostling, competing. And where all these language groups, Indo-European, Semitic, Sino-Tibetan, Turkic, met and mixed.
And these pathways, the ones the German geologist von Richthofen later called the Silk Roads in the 19th century, they were basically the world's central nervous system. They connected everyone and everything. And they carried not just wealth and prosperity, but also, inevitably, death, violence, disease, disaster spread along these roads too. Connection always cuts both ways, right?
Okay, so if this region was so central, so vital, so foundational, why did it kind of disappear from mainstream history, from our general understanding?
Well, the book points to a couple of things. One is what Edward Said famously termed Orientalism, this overwhelmingly negative, sometimes romanticized, but ultimately dismissive Western view of the East, seeing it as undeveloped, inferior. Basically, its history wasn't seen as worthy of serious attention. And then there's just the sheer weight of that dominant Western narrative. It just didn't leave much room, intellectually or historically, for what it saw as the edges.
So it's really important to reclaim those stories, those lost glories.
Yeah.
Because the past of these places is just incredibly rich. We hear Kabul today and think conflict, maybe. But the book talks about Babur's beautiful Garden of Fidelity. There are oranges, pomegranates, clover, a place of beauty.
Exactly. Or think about Iran's historical reputation for amazing taste in fruit, in art, like miniature portraits. There's this great bit about Simi Nishapura, a Persian calligrapher around 1400 who was very particular about paper. The best stuff. It came specifically from Damascus, Baghdad, or Samarkand. Nowhere else would do. And cities like Merv were called the mother of the world. Ray, near modern Tehran, the bridegroom of the earth. These were major world centers.
And for centuries, way before the modern era, the world's leading intellectual centers, the Oxfords, the Cambridges, the Harvards of their day, they weren't in Europe. They were places like Baghdad, Balkh, Bukhara, Samarkand, home to absolute giants like Ibn Sina Avicenna, a pioneer in medicine and philosophy.
Right, and al-Biruni, a polymath working on astronomy, geography. And al-Khwarizmi, his work gave us algebra, algorithms. These weren't peripheral figures. They were at the cutting edge of global knowledge.
So what did that focus on knowledge and innovation actually mean for those societies back then?
That's a great question, because this drive for progress seems to have been fundamental, almost like a core principle. There's a quote from King Wuling of Zhou in China back in 307 BC. He said, "A talent for following the ways of yesterday is not sufficient to improve the world of today." That's not just a neat line. It shows this really ancient understanding that you needed innovation, you needed exchange to actually move society forward. It wasn't just a nice to have.
Speaking of empires, the book really dives into the Persian Empire, starting around the 6th century BC, describes it as maybe the greatest of them all. Even the Greek historian Herodotus noted how open they were to foreign customs, adopting things like the clothing of people they conquered. They had incredibly sophisticated administration, a road system allowing messages to cross, over 1,600 miles in just a week? Amazing.
Yeah, and Darius's palace. It was like a microcosm of the known world. Ebony and silver from Egypt, cedar from Lebanon, gold from Bactria, lapis lazuli from Sogdiana, turquoise from Khwarezm, ivory from India, all brought together.
Just incredible.
But what's also striking is the complex relationship they had with the nomads from the steppes. You hear these wild stories. They drank blood, ate their fathers. But they were also vital trading partners, supplying livestock and especially horses, which were crucial. And these nomads were powerful. Cyrus the Great, the founder of the empire, was actually killed fighting the Scythians, a stark reminder of their power.
And this brings us to a key figure in the book's argument, Alexander the Great. We often think of his European links, but Frankopan argues Alexander looked decisively east for glory, for culture, for opportunity, not west. After taking Egypt, he smashed Darius III at Gaugamela in 331 BC. Babylon apparently welcomed him with flowers on the roads like a liberator. His focus was clearly eastward.
And what's fascinating is how he handled conquest. The book describes his surprisingly delicate touch. He showed real respect for local religions, restored Cyrus the Great's tomb, punished those who damaged it, gave Darius a proper burial. His strategy wasn't just brute force. He relied on local elites, adopted traditional titles, even wore Persian clothing sometimes. He understood he needed to be seen as a legitimate successor, not just an invader, to hold that vast empire together.
And the legacy was this profound spread of Greek culture Hellenization. You saw Greek influence everywhere. In Afghanistan, at Akanum, they literally carved sayings from Delphi onto a monument, miles from Greece. Greek was used by officials in Bactria. Even the edicts of Ashoka, the great Indian ruler, had parallel Greek translations. It was a practical working language across huge areas.
The cultural exchange was just astonishing. It really changed things. Take Buddha statues, for instance. They only started appearing after the Greek cult of Apollo took root in the Gandhar region. The book suggests Apollo basically provided the visual template for depicting a divine figure. It forced Buddhists to innovate visually.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, and Greek influence shows up in art found in places like Tilla Tepe in Afghanistan. In India, the Greeks were apparently revered like gods for their scientific knowledge, especially astronomy. The book even floats the idea of literary borrowing the Indian Ramayana, maybe drawing on the Iliad and Odyssey, or Virgil's Aeneid borrowing from the Indian Mahabharata. Ideas and stories were flowing constantly along these routes.
Okay, let's shift focus further east now to China. Under the Han Dynasty, that's roughly 206 BC to AD 220, China really started pushing its borders west into Xinjiang, what they called Xiu, the western regions. This opened up vital routes like the Gansu Corridor running through Dunhuang out towards Kashgar, a pivotal expansion.
And a huge driver for that, and for a lot of the early Silk Road trade, was China's almost desperate need for good horses. They especially wanted the Hangsuima, the famous sweating blood horses from the Fergana Valley. Legendary creatures supposedly sired by dragons. Some became genuine celebrities, called Tiama, or celestial horses. The desire was so strong, one emperor was apparently buried with 80 of his favorites. Shows how important they were, strategically and symbolically.
And how did China pay for these horses and for keeping peace with powerful groups like the Xiongnu nomads? Primarily with silk. Huge amounts of tribute went out in luxury goods, but especially silk. It became a symbol of political power, sure, but also basically an international currency.
It was used to pay soldiers, even used for fines in Buddhist monasteries. There's one record from 1 BC of the Xiongnu getting 30,000 rolls of silk in one go. It was serious geopolitical business.
So how organized was all this? Was it just chaotic trade, or was there more structure?
Well, it was highly organized, especially on the Chinese side. The book talks about this amazing find, 35,000 texts from Songquan, the garrison town near Dunhuang. They paint this incredibly detailed picture. Foreign visitors had to use specific routes, carry passes, get counted regularly. Records were kept like hotel guest logs, names, dates, even the condition of their horses or camels. It shows that globalization, with all its opportunities, its problems, its need for tracking and technology, it was a complex fact of life 2,000 years ago, not something new.
Meanwhile, back west, Rome is transforming from this sort of provincial town into a massive empire. But the book argues its real success, its lasting glory, didn't come so much from conquering Europe, which was often tough and unrewarding. It came from turning east, specifically towards the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. The big turning point was seizing Egypt in 30 BC.
Absolutely. The impact of Egypt's wealth on Rome was just enormous. Grain prices dropped, interest rates fell sharply from 12% down to 4%. This fueled a huge property boom. Suddenly, there was more disposable income around. It's partly why Augustus could boast he found Rome a city of brick and left it one of marble. But this wealth came from pretty ruthless exploitation. There was a poll tax in Egypt, part of what one scholar called an ancient apartheid system. Even the census in Judea that we read about in the Christmas story that was basically a Roman tax measure shows how far Rome's economic reach went and its very real impact on people's lives.
And how did the Romans themselves view all this Eastern wealth and influence? It seems complicated. Cicero talks about Asia being indescribably rich, but you also get these moralizing writers like Sallust and Juvenal. They complain that Eastern luxuries were making Romans soft, turning tough soldiers into lovers of lazy luxury and decadence.
Yeah, Juvenal famously gripped that the Orontes River from Syria had basically flowed into the Tiber, meaning Asian ways had corrupted good old Roman virtues. So there was this mix of fascination and real anxiety.
But despite the hand-wringing about decadence, Rome was clearly still captivated by the East, wasn't it?
Utterly. Augustus wasn't just sitting back. He sent expeditions exploring down into Ethiopia and Yemen, ordered surveys of the Persian Gulf. They even compiled these detailed guides like the Stathmoi Parthikoi, basically a Roman roadmap listing routes, distances, stopping points deep into Central Asia, all the way to Kandahar and Afghanistan. This was active imperial intelligence gathering.
And the trade itself just exploded. The geographer Strabo mentioned 120 Roman ships sailing to India every single year from the Red Sea. That's a lot of ships. We find Roman pottery, lamps, mirrors, statues all over India, and Indian Tamil literature talks about Roman ships arriving, bringing gold laden with pepper and exporting cool and fragrant wine. You can almost taste it.
Which brings us neatly to the silk controversy in Rome. This Roman obsession with Chinese silk caused genuine moral panic. Seneca the philosopher was outraged. He called it practically indecent, barely clothing, bad for marriages because it was so revealing. And then you have Pliny the Elder, the naturalist, worrying about the economics. He estimated 100 million sesterces flowed out of the Roman economy every year for silk, pearls, spices, and other Eastern luxuries. That was an absolutely staggering amount, maybe nearly half the empire's entire mint output. So it wasn't just fashion, it was a major economic drain and a moral issue for them.
But that Roman spending had a huge impact along the trade routes themselves, right? It fueled local economies.
Absolutely. It transformed places. Villages became towns. Towns grew into major cities. Think of Palmyra out on the edge of the Syrian desert. It became known as the Venice of the Sands. And Petra, of course, became this architectural wonder, all built on the wealth flowing along these trade arteries.
And further east.
Well, the Kushan Empire, which was east of Persia, got incredibly rich acting as middlemen in this trade. They even started minting coins that directly copied Roman designs. It shows just how powerful Rome's economic influence was, even in places they didn't directly rule or even have much contact with China yet. The clear sign of a globalized economy back then.
Now, Rome always seemed to have its eye on Persia, often as a rival, a military target. Trajan had that spectacular, though short-lived, conquest around 113 AD, declaring Persia capta, Persia conquered. And there's that story of him looking out at the Persian Gulf, seeing a ship heading for India, and wishing he was young enough to follow Alexander's path.
Yeah, but the tables could turn dramatically. Later you have the humiliation of Emperor Valerian, defeated, captured, apparently flayed, and stuffed by the Persians. A really grim symbol of how power could shift.
So Persia wasn't just a passive target.
Not at all. In fact, the book argues that constant Roman pressure actually spurred Persia on. It led to this major internal transformation, the rise of the Sasanian dynasty around 220 AD. They aggressively centralized power, reformed administration, launched huge infrastructure projects, building up their capital Ctesiphon, developing ports like Kerosene, massive irrigation works. This wasn't just defense, it was a Persian Renaissance, boosting trade, strengthening the state, and making them a really formidable power confronting Rome.
But while Persia was having this resurgence, Rome itself started facing serious problems, particularly by around 300 AD. Huge pressure on its eastern borders, internal divisions, economic trouble.
Yeah, Diocletian's reforms sound almost desperate, counting every single vine and fruit tree for tax purposes, setting price controls on everything from shoes to cinnamon to fight inflation, and his eventual retirement, to go off and grow cabbages in Croatia, saying power held no more temptation. It kind of symbolizes Rome's lowered horizons, shifting from global ambition to just wanting local stability, maybe even survival.
So what happened next? If Rome was struggling, where did the focus shift?
Well, Constantine had this incredibly bold idea. Facing all these challenges, he decided to build a completely new capital. And crucially, he didn't build it in the West. He chose Byzantium, this strategic spot right at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. It became Constantinople. This amazing new city grew to rival and eventually surpass Old Rome. It cemented the empire's eastward focus, anchoring it near the vital trade routes and the center of political gravity. It was a huge statement about where the future lay.
When you pull it all together, what really stands out is just how interconnected the ancient world was. It really blows away that idea of everyone living in purely local bubbles. I mean, Chinese silks worn in North Africa, pottery from France found in Britain and the Persian Gulf, Indian spices used in Western China and in Rome, Greek inscriptions in Afghanistan, Central Asian horses ridden in China. It's mind-boggling.
There's a great image the book uses to capture this. Imagine a single gold coin. Maybe it starts its life on the frontier in Britain, paid to a Roman soldier. It travels back to Rome. Then a merchant takes it east, all the way to Gaza, a big port in India. It's admired by kings in the Hindu Kush Mountains, and eventually gets copied by an engraver who might be Roman, Persian, Indian, Chinese. Who knows? That single coin's journey just perfectly illustrates this complex, vibrant, competitive global exchange happening 2,000 years ago. It wasn't simple, it was dynamic.
So the core message of the book really is that the ancient world was far more complex, far more linked up than we usually think. Rome wasn't just influencing others, it was profoundly shaped by the East. And this whole belt of towns formed a chain spanning Asia, with East and West constantly looking towards each other. It forces us to see a much more shared global past.
Exactly. And it wasn't just goods and politics moving east to west and back again. The book leaves us with this thought. Not only did Rome's eyes turn east, but maybe its soul did too. Because the new faith of Christianity, emerging from what seemed like an unimportant province in the East, was about to spread like wildfire along these very same roads, changing everything.
So a final thought for you, our listener.
Yeah.
Maybe keep questioning the history you were taught. Try looking at the world map and our shared past through this wider, more interconnected lens. You might find that this global legacy reaches much further and perhaps is much closer to home than you ever imagined.